There are questions in your life that are not really questions at all. They arrive disguised in the mundane, wrapped in the ordinary fabric of a Tuesday night or a casual text message. But they are, in reality, hinges. They are the pivot points upon which the entire architecture of your future can swing open or shut. They are rarely grand or poetic. They are simple things like, "Are you busy later?" or "Can you give me a ride?" And in my case, the question that altered the atmospheric pressure of my entire world was quieter still, delivered via a string of blue bubbles on a screen as I sat in the dim light of our shared living room. It was from Liam, and it said, simply, "Hey, can you wait up for me?" It was a request, not a demand. It was phrased with the casual ease that had defined our friendship for the past 6 years, a friendship built on a foundation of late-night study sessions, shared pizzas, and the easy, unspoken understanding that we were each other's constant in a city that was anything but. Yet, the words hummed with a different frequency that night. They landed not in my logical mind, which understood he probably just wanted to vent about a client or a coding bug, but in the hollow, resonant chamber of my heart, where I had kept my feelings for him locked away like undeveloped film, too precious and too volatile to expose to the light. To wait up for him. It was a task I performed internally every single night, a silent vigil I kept until I heard the familiar scrape of his key in the lock, followed by the soft thud of his laptop bag hitting the floor. To be asked to do it, to have the silent ritual brought out into the open, felt like being seen in a way I had never allowed myself to be. So I sat on our worn, gray couch, the one with a faint coffee stain shaped like the continent of Australia, and I waited. The only light came from the street lamp outside, filtering through the blinds and casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. It was a photographer's light, a moody, low-contrast glow that revealed and concealed in equal measure, and I found myself studying the space as if through a viewfinder. I saw the ghost of our friendship in every object. The stack of board games we never played, the framed photo of us at graduation, grinning and foolishly young, the ridiculous ceramic frog Liam had won at a carnival and insisted was our apartment's guardian. This room was a repository of our shared history, a carefully curated museum of platonic affection. And as the minutes stretched into an hour, I felt a low-grade tremor of anxiety, the fear that this one simple request was about to become an earthquake, shaking the very foundations I had so carefully built around my heart. He was supposed to be at a team dinner, a long, boisterous affair that usually kept him out past midnight. But when my phone buzzed again, it was only 9:30. The message was even shorter than the first. "On my way. Left early. Left early." The words were a stone dropped into the still pool of my waiting. The ripples spread out, carrying with them 1,000 frantic questions. Why? Was something wrong? Did he get into an argument? Or the most dangerous question of all, the one I barely dared to form. Did he leave early to come home to me? I told myself it was absurd. I was his roommate, his friend, his emotional backstop since his world had imploded 3 months ago. That was my role, the quiet observer, the steady presence who listened and nodded and never, ever asked for anything in return. To imagine anything more was a form of self-destruction, a fantasy that could shatter the most important relationship in my life. And yet, as I heard the telltale sound of the elevator dinging on our floor, my heart began to beat a frantic, hopeful rhythm against my ribs, a traitorous drumbeat signaling the arrival of a future I had never, ever believed was possible. The key turned in the lock, the door swung open, and there he was, silhouetted against the harsh light of the hallway, and the story I had been telling myself for 6 years began to unravel. Our story, like most that truly matter, had begun with an accident of bureaucracy. We were assigned as freshman roommates by a housing algorithm that, in its cold, binary logic, managed to create something profoundly human. I walked into room 3B of Caldwell Hall with a box of photography books and a nervous tremor in my hands, and he was already there, sprawled on the bed by the window, a supernova of easy confidence and athletic grace. He was all bright smiles and boundless energy, a stark contrast to my quieter, more observational nature. Liam was a runner on the university's track team, his life a disciplined series of sprints and cool-downs, while mine was spent in the patient stillness of the darkroom, waiting for images to emerge from the chemical bath. We were light and shadow, motion and stillness. It should not have worked. But it did. From the very first day, there was an effortless synchronicity to our cohabitation. He seemed to intuitively understand my need for quiet, just as I understood his need to fill the room with the kinetic energy of his post-run restlessness. He would burst through the door, smelling of sweat and crisp autumn air, and I would look up from my editing, and we would just exist in the same space, a comfortable silence settling between us that was more companionable than any conversation. He learned to recognize the specific scent of developer fluid as a sign that I was in my creative zone and knew not to interrupt. I learned that the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his fingers on his desk meant he was stuck on a line of code, and that it was the perfect time to offer him a cup of tea. We built a friendship in these small, unspoken gestures, a language unique to the two of us. He drew me out of my shell, pulling me along to parties where I would stand awkwardly in a corner, nursing a single drink, while he moved through the crowd like a conquering hero. He never pressured me to be more like him. He simply created a space for me to exist at the edge of his vibrant world, occasionally tossing a smile or a comment over his shoulder to let me know I was still tethered to him. In return, I offered him a sanctuary from that world. Our room became the place he could retreat to when the pressures of his sport and his demanding computer science major became too much. He would collapse onto his bed, stare at the ceiling, and talk for hours about race times and algorithmic efficiency, and I would just listen, absorbing his anxieties until the frantic energy in him subsided into a weary calm. I became the curator of his calm, the keeper of his quiet moments. My feelings for him, the ones that now held me captive on the couch, had not been a sudden revelation. They had developed slowly, like a photograph emerging in the tray, faint at first, then gradually gaining definition and depth until the image was undeniable. For the first few years, I genuinely believed it was just a deep, profound friendship. I loved him, of course, in the way you love a brother, a true partner in the chaotic experiment of becoming an adult. I admired his drive, his unwavering optimism, his fundamental goodness. But there was a specific moment, a single frame in the long film of our friendship, where the quality of the light changed, and I saw him, and my feelings for him, in a new and terrifying clarity. It was the end of our junior year. He had just run the final, decisive leg of a championship relay, securing a victory for the team, but also pushing his body to its absolute limit. I had watched from the stands, my camera forgotten in my lap, my entire being focused on the raw, beautiful agony of his exertion. Later that evening, I found him not at the victory party, but back in our room, sitting on the floor in the dark, his trophy discarded on his desk. He was icing his knee, his face pale, and etched with a pain that was more than just physical. He looked up as I entered, and his usual bright facade was gone, replaced by a startling vulnerability. He told me he was terrified that he had peaked, that this was the best he would ever be, that the rest of his life would be a slow, disappointing decline from this one perfect moment. He spoke in a low, halting voice, and I sat on the floor across from him, the space between us charged with an intimacy that felt new and fragile. In that moment, he was not the campus star, the confident athlete, the coding prodigy. He was just Liam, scared and uncertain, his brilliance momentarily eclipsed by the shadow of his own humanity. And as I looked at him, truly looked at him, I felt a shift deep within my own architecture. The comfortable, fraternal affection I had always felt for him fractured, and something else flooded into the cracks, a fierce, protective, and unmistakably romantic love. It was a terrifying realization. Because I knew, with the certainty of a photographer who knows which negatives are hopelessly overexposed, that Liam was straight. He had a steady rotation of girlfriends, all of them bright, beautiful women who seemed to fit so perfectly into the sunlit world he inhabited. My love for him felt like a darkroom secret, something that could only exist in the absence of light, something that would be ruined by exposure. So I did what I had always done. I observed. I listened. I pushed my feelings down, packing them away into a light-proof box in the corner of my soul. I became an expert in the art of loving from a distance, of finding satisfaction in the simple privilege of his proximity. I learned to interpret the subtle shifts in his mood, the minute tightening around his eyes that signaled stress, the slight uptick in the corner of his mouth that meant he was genuinely happy. I cataloged these details, these tiny fragments of him, and they became my secret treasures. We graduated and, against all odds, decided to get an apartment together. It felt both like a dream and a sentence. I would have him in my life, his constant, reassuring presence a daily reality. But I would also have to live with the constant, low-level ache of this unrequited love, a ghost limb that throbbed with a pain no one else could see. And for 3 years, that was enough. We built a life in our small 2-bedroom apartment, a seamless continuation of the comfortable world we had created in our dorm room. He got a demanding job as a consultant that had him traveling frequently, and I began to build a career as a freelance photographer. The rhythm of our lives was established. His departures and arrivals, my long, quiet days of editing, our shared evenings of takeout and bad television. It was a stable, predictable orbit. And then, 3 months ago, that orbit was shattered by a stray asteroid named Charlotte. She was his girlfriend of 2 years, the one everyone, including me, thought was the one. She was smart, funny, and she adored him. I had steeled myself for the inevitable announcement of their engagement, practicing the congratulatory smile in the mirror until it looked almost genuine. But instead of an engagement, there was a breakup. It was sudden, brutal, and it completely blindsided him. She had met someone else. It was that simple and that devastating. Liam, who had always moved through life with such effortless forward momentum, was suddenly brought to a dead stop. He was lost. The first few weeks after the breakup were a blur of helpless anger and profound sadness. He would come home from work, his shoulders slumped, the light in his eyes dimmed to a pilot light. He stopped running. He stopped coding on his passion projects. He just stopped. He would sit on the couch, the same one I was sitting on now, and stare into space, lost in a labyrinth of his own grief. And I, the quiet observer, stepped into the role I had been unknowingly rehearsing for years. I became his anchor. I made sure he ate. I listened to him retell the story of their relationship 100 times, searching for the exact moment it had all gone wrong. I sat with him in the suffocating silence, a silent promise that he was not alone in his wreckage. I didn't offer advice or platitudes. I just offered my presence. It was all I had to give. Slowly, tentatively, he began to lean on me in ways he never had before. The emotional boundary between us, once so clearly defined, began to blur and soften. But it was the physical boundary that dissolved in a way that left me breathless. It started about a month after Charlotte left. We were watching a movie, a mindless action flick I had chosen specifically to distract him. He was sitting at the far end of the couch, wrapped in a blanket, a fortress of solitude. Halfway through the film, without a word, he shifted, stretched out his legs, and rested his head on my lap. My entire body went rigid. I froze, my breath caught in my chest, certain that any movement would shatter the moment. He smelled faintly of the sandalwood soap he used, a clean, earthy scent that was so intrinsically him. I could feel the warmth of his scalp through the thin fabric of my jeans, the soft texture of his hair against my thigh. It was an act of such casual, thoughtless intimacy that it felt more profound than any grand romantic gesture. He fell asleep there, his breathing evening out into a soft, rhythmic puff against my leg, and I sat perfectly still for over an hour, my muscles cramping, my heart a chaotic symphony of joy and terror, until the credits rolled. I didn't want to wake him. I never wanted the moment to end. That night became the blueprint for a new ritual. It was not discussed. It was not planned. It just began to happen. 2 or 3 nights a week, we would end up on the couch, and at some point, he would gravitate towards me. Sometimes he would just lean his head against my shoulder as we watched TV, his proximity a warm, solid weight that both grounded and electrified me. Other times, he would curl up completely, his back pressed against my side, one of his arms draped loosely over my stomach. He always used exhaustion as a pretext. "I'm so wrecked," he'd sigh, before shifting closer, as if my body were a charging station for his depleted energy. And I, in my infinite capacity for self-deception, allowed him the plausible deniability. I told myself it meant nothing. It was just comfort. He was my friend, he was hurting, and he was seeking solace in the safest place he knew. It was a story that made sense, a story that kept me from hoping for the impossible. But hope is a tenacious weed. It grows in the most barren soil, pushing its way through the cracks in your carefully constructed logic. With every touch, a new shoot of hope would emerge. I started to live for those evenings on the couch. My entire day would be a prelude, a long, anxious wait for the moment when the sun would go down and the unspoken invitation to our ritual would hang in the air between us. I became a scholar of his smallest gestures. I learned the difference between the tired slump of his shoulders after a long day and the deliberate, seeking lean that preceded him resting his head on my shoulder. I could differentiate the accidental brush of his hand against mine from the fleeting, almost imperceptible hesitation that felt like a question. My photographer's eye, trained to notice the subtle interplay of light and shadow, was now hyper-focused on the landscape of our friendship, desperately searching for proof that the light was changing for him, too. Another ritual began, one that was even more subtle and, to me, more significant. He started leaving his bedroom door ajar when he went to sleep. For 6 years, that door had been a solid, uncompromising boundary. We were friends, we were roommates, but we had our separate spaces, our private worlds. The closed door was a symbol of that respectful distance. But after the breakup, after the couch ritual began, I started noticing it. Just a crack at first, a sliver of darkness that was different from the solid wood I was used to seeing. Then it became a few inches, then a foot. It was never wide open, always existing in that ambiguous space between open and closed. I would lie in my own bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What did it mean? Was it an unconscious signal of his newfound vulnerability? A desire to not feel so alone in the dark? Or, as my treacherous heart whispered, was it an invitation? An unspoken permission for me to cross a threshold I had never dared to approach. I never did, of course. I was too afraid of what I would find on the other side, or worse, what I wouldn't. I was a cartographer of our unspoken language, and I knew that to ask for a direct translation was to risk destroying the entire map. So we existed in this gray area, this beautiful, agonizing limbo. Our apartment became a hushed sanctuary of unspoken things. The air was thick with tension, but it was a soft, warm tension, not an abrasive one. It was the feeling of a held breath, of a storm gathering just over the horizon, beautiful and terrifying in its potential. I felt like I was living inside one of my own photographs, a long exposure shot where everything was slightly blurred, full of motion and emotion that couldn't be pinned down to a single, sharp instant. I was both the photographer and the subject, observing the scene unfold while also being utterly consumed by it. And every night, the couch became our stage, the place where this silent play was performed. His head on my lap, my hand hovering just above his hair, wanting so desperately to touch him but paralyzed by the fear of misreading the script. It was a sweet, slow torture, and I had resigned myself to living in it forever. Which brought me back to tonight, to the waiting, to the sound of his key in the lock and the sight of him in the doorway. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, and the room was plunged back into the intimate gloom of the streetlights. He dropped his bag, the sound softer than usual, less weary and more deliberate. He stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness, and I watched him, my heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. He wasn't wearing his usual work suit. He was in jeans and a simple gray Henley, his travel blazer slung over his arm. He looked younger, less like the high-powered consultant and more like the boy I had met in room 3B. "Hey," he said, his voice low, a little rough. "Hey," I replied, my own voice surprisingly steady. "Bad dinner." He walked slowly towards the couch, not with his usual exhausted slump, but with a quiet intention that made the hair on my arm stand up. He didn't answer my question. Instead, he stopped in front of me, looking down at me where I sat. In the dim light, I couldn't quite read his expression, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze. It was a different kind of look, not the friendly, open gaze I knew so well. This was searching, questioning. "It wasn't bad," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to be here." And there it was. Not a hint, not a subtle gesture, but a direct statement. A confession that landed in the silent room with the force of a thunderclap. I wanted to be here. With me. He had left his colleagues, his clients, his world of professional obligations, because he wanted to be in this quiet room. The hope I had been so carefully suppressing surged through me, hot and overwhelming. I felt my carefully constructed defenses crumble to dust, leaving me completely exposed. I couldn't speak. I could only look up at him, my entire life's worth of unspoken feelings plain on my face. I was sure of it. He didn't move to the far end of the couch. He didn't even sit down in the armchair. He sank down onto the couch right next to me, so close that our knees brushed. The contact was electric, a small spark that seemed to arc through the entire space between us. He turned his body to face me, the blazer forgotten on the floor. He was so close I could see the faint constellation of freckles across his nose, the way the streetlight caught the gold flecks in his hazel eyes. The air grew thick, heavy with everything we had never said, with 6 years of quiet mornings and late nights, with hundreds of hours spent in this exact spot, separated by an invisible wall that suddenly felt paper-thin. He just looked at me for what felt like an eternity, his eyes tracing the lines of my face as if he were seeing me for the first time. My mind was a blank slate, all my careful analysis and overthinking erased by the sheer, overwhelming reality of his presence. This was no longer a ritual shrouded in the plausible deniability of exhaustion. This was something else. This was intentional. He was here, he was close, and he was looking at me in a way that made it impossible to breathe. "Caleb," he whispered, my name a soft, unfamiliar sound on his lips in this context. I could only manage a nod. He raised a hand, his movements slow, hesitant, as if he were afraid I might bolt. He didn't touch my face. Instead, his fingers brushed against the sleeve of my shirt, a feather-light touch just above my elbow. It was nothing, a barely there contact, but my entire nervous system lit up in response. It was a question. It was permission being sought. I held his gaze, trying to pour all the answers I couldn't speak into my eyes. Yes, always yes. His own gaze flickered down to my lips, then back up to my eyes. The slight tremor in his hand traveled up my arm, a physical manifestation of the vulnerability that was rolling off him in waves. He was nervous. Liam, the man who could command a boardroom and own a running track, was nervous. With me. "Can I ask you something weird?" he asked, his voice cracking on the last word. My throat was tight, but I forced the word out. "Anything." He took a shallow, shaky breath, the kind you take before a plunge into cold water. He never broke eye contact. The world seemed to shrink until it was nothing but the few inches of charged air separating our faces, the sound of our breathing, the frantic beat of my own heart. "Would it be okay," he began, his whisper so quiet I had to lean in slightly to hear it, "if I kissed you?" The hinge swung. The question, so simple, so direct, so terrifyingly beautiful, unlocked everything. It wasn't a move made in the ambiguity of grief or exhaustion. It was a choice, articulated and offered to me for my consent. He was giving me the power, the control, laying his own vulnerability at my feet. In that moment, the years of pining, of quiet observation, of hopeless yearning, didn't feel tragic. They felt like a long, slow journey to this single, perfect point in time. My fear evaporated, replaced by a profound, soaring sense of clarity. This was real. This was happening. I didn't answer with a word. I couldn't. Instead, I closed the small distance between us. My hand came up to cup his jaw, my thumb stroking the slight stubble there. His skin was warm, real beneath my touch. He let out a shuddering breath, a sound of pure relief, and leaned into my hand, his eyes fluttering shut. And then I kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of arrival, of recognition. It was soft, tentative, a gentle press of lips that spoke a language more eloquent than words. It tasted of coffee and mint and the unique, indescribable flavor of Liam himself. It was a question and an answer, a beginning and an end. It was everything I had ever secretly wanted, and it was happening on our worn, gray couch, in the quiet dark, and it was more perfect than any fantasy I had ever dared to construct. When we finally pulled apart, we just rested our foreheads together, breathing the same air, the silence between us no longer filled with unspoken tension, but with a fragile, shimmering peace. The storm had arrived, and it was beautiful. The morning after was a study in silence, but it was a different species of silence from the one we had cultivated before. The comfortable, easy quiet of our friendship was gone, and in its place was a brittle, high-tension wire of awkwardness that vibrated with every small movement. I woke up first, my mind a chaotic slideshow of the night before. The softness of his lips, the surprised, relieved sound he'd made in the back of his throat, the way he had held my face in his hands as if I were something precious. After the kiss, there had been another, and then another, each one deeper and more certain than the last. We hadn't talked. We had simply held each other on the couch for a long time, a silent, mutual agreement to let the moment exist without the burden of analysis. Eventually, he had whispered a quiet good night, squeezed my hand, and retreated to his room, closing the door firmly behind him. Not ajar. Closed. I lay in my bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, my body thrumming with a joy so potent it was almost painful. It felt like the world had been muted my whole life, and someone had just turned up the volume. Colors seemed brighter, sounds sharper. But beneath the euphoria was a deep, cold current of fear. What now? What did this mean? Had I just been a momentary lapse in judgment, a port in his emotional storm? The closed door felt like an answer, and it was one that terrified me. When I finally emerged into the living room, the sun was streaming in, painfully bright. Liam was already in the kitchen, his back to me, making coffee. He was dressed for work, his movements stiff and unnaturally precise. He didn't turn around when he heard me, though I knew he had. I could see the rigid set of his shoulders. "Morning," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet apartment. "Morning," he mumbled back, his focus entirely on the sputtering coffee machine. He didn't turn. He didn't look at me. The man who had looked at me with such raw vulnerability just hours before was now treating me like a stranger he'd been forced to share a counter with. The joy in my chest began to curdle into a sick, heavy dread. He poured his coffee into a travel mug, added a splash of milk, and finally turned, but his eyes were fixed on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and pale. The gold flecks in his eyes were invisible today. "I've got an early meeting," he said, his tone clipped, professional. "Gotta run." He moved to walk past me, and for a second, I thought he would just leave. That he would walk out the door and pretend last night had been a dream, a hallucination. The thought was so unbearable that I instinctively stepped into his path, a small, desperate move to keep him from escaping. "Liam," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Last night." He flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but I saw it. He finally met my eyes, and what I saw there shattered me. It was not desire or confusion or even affection. It was panic. Pure, unadulterated panic. "Look, Caleb," he started, running a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I knew well. "About that. I was really out of it. Stressed from work, you know? And with everything with Charlotte still. I wasn't thinking straight. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. It was a mistake. A mistake." The word was a physical blow. It knocked the air from my lungs, leaving a cold, empty vacuum where all that soaring hope had been. A mistake. I had been a mistake. A symptom of his stress and his grief. I felt a flush of shame so intense it was dizzying. He saw me not as a person he had feelings for, but as a moment of weakness, an error to be corrected. My carefully guarded heart, which I had so bravely offered him, felt like it had been trampled and discarded. I stepped back, clearing the path for him. I couldn't look at him anymore. I just stared at the floor, at the familiar pattern of the hardwood, focusing on the grain of the wood to keep myself from completely falling apart. I felt his hesitation, a brief pause where I imagined he might have wanted to say something more, but he didn't. I heard the click of his travel mug as he set it down to grab his bag, the rustle of his jacket, and then the final, damning sound of the front door closing behind him. And I was alone again, in the same room where my world had been remade, now left with nothing but the ruins. The days that followed were the worst of my life, far more painful than the years of silent pining. Before, there had been the comfort of our friendship. Now, there was nothing. A chasm had opened between us, and we were two strangers living on opposite sides, shouting across the void with polite, meaningless pleasantries. "Have a good day. Don't forget to take out the recycling. Need anything from the store?" The easy intimacy we had shared was gone, replaced by a suffocating politeness. He started coming home late and leaving early. The couch ritual stopped entirely. We no longer watched movies together. He would eat dinner in his room, The door closed. Always closed. The apartment, once my sanctuary, felt like a prison. Every object was a painful reminder of what I had lost, of the beautiful, fragile thing we had built, and that he had so carelessly demolished. I retreated into myself, into my work. I spent long hours in the darkroom, the smell of chemicals a familiar, acrid comfort. I printed photos, losing myself in the process, in the magic of bringing images to life. But even there, I couldn't escape him. I found myself looking at portraits I had taken of him over the years, candid shots from college, a formal portrait for his consulting firm's website, a picture of him laughing on a beach one summer. In every image, I saw what I had always seen, the kindness in his eyes, the easy confidence of his smile. But now, they looked like photographs of a ghost, a person who no longer existed. My grief was sharp and relentless. I had not just lost the possibility of a future with him. I had lost my best friend, my anchor, my home. The silence in the apartment was a living thing, a malevolent entity that mocked me with memories. After nearly 2 weeks of this Cold War, something in me broke. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't live in the wreckage, stepping over the rubble of our friendship every single day. The pain was one thing, but the ambiguity was another. His apology, it was a mistake, felt insufficient, a flimsy bandage on a mortal wound. I needed to understand. Even if the truth was that I meant nothing to him, I needed to hear it. I needed the finality of it to begin the long, arduous process of moving on. I deserved more than a panicked apology in the hallway. I deserved the truth. That evening, I waited for him, not on the couch, but at the kitchen table. I made dinner, his favorite pasta, a peace offering of sorts. When he came home, looking as weary and broken as I felt, he stopped short when he saw me sitting there, the table set for two. I was just going to grab something on my way home, he said, avoiding my eyes. Sit down, Liam, I said. My voice was quiet, but it held a firmness that surprised even me. We need to talk. He hesitated, his internal conflict plain on his face. For a moment, I thought he would refuse, that he would retreat to the safety of his room. But then, with a deep, resigned sigh, he dropped his bag and sat down across from me. He didn't look at the food. He just stared at his hands, clasped tightly on the table. I let the silence stretch for a moment, gathering my courage. What he said that morning, I began, my voice shaking slightly. Was that the truth? Was it just a mistake? He wouldn't look at me. He just gave a small, jerky nod, his eyes still fixed on his knuckles. A mistake because it was with me? I pressed, my voice cracking. Because I'm a man. No, he said, his voice so low it was almost inaudible. Caleb, no? It's not that. Then what is it? I asked, my frustration finally boiling over. Because from where I'm sitting, you kissed me, you acted like it meant something, and then you treated me like I was a piece of garbage you'd accidentally stepped in. You destroyed our friendship, Liam. For what? A moment of not thinking straight. I don't believe you. I know you. You don't do things you don't mean. So talk to me. Tell me the truth. Whatever it is, I think after 6 years, I at least deserve that. My words hung in the air between us. He finally looked up, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. The panic was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow sadness that mirrored my own. When he spoke, his voice was raw with a pain he had clearly been holding in for weeks. It wasn't a mistake because it was you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It was a mistake because I liked it. And that terrifies me. The confession was so quiet, so simple, but it changed everything again. He looked down, shamefaced, as if he had just admitted to a terrible crime. I've spent my whole life on a track, Caleb, he continued, his voice trembling. Literally and figuratively. You run in your lane. You follow the path. You date the right girls. You get the right job. You build the right life. Everything is planned. Everything makes sense. And then, Charlotte left, and my whole world fell apart. And you were there. You were the only thing that was solid, the only thing that made sense. He took a shaky breath. That night on the couch, it wasn't about being tired. It was never about being tired. It was about being near you. It was the only place I felt safe. The only place I felt quiet inside. And I started to realize that the feeling I had, sitting there with you, was better than any feeling I ever had with her. It was deeper. It was real. He finally looked me straight in the eye, and the vulnerability I had seen the night of the kiss was back, tenfold. When I kissed you, it was like coming home. It felt right. More right than anything has ever felt. And the moment it was over, I panicked. Because it didn't fit into the plan. It didn't fit into who I thought I was. What does this mean? Am I gay? Am I bi? I don't know what I am. All I know is that I have these feelings for my best friend, for you, and it scares the hell out of me. I was so afraid of what it meant, afraid of ruining what we had, that I tried to just erase it. I tried to put it back in the box and pretend it never happened. I was a coward, and I hurt you. And I am so sorry, Caleb. I am so sorry. Tears were streaming down his face now, silent and unheeded. He wasn't the confident athlete or the brilliant consultant. He was just Liam, my Liam, lost and scared and trying to navigate a map he had never seen before. All my anger, all my hurt, dissolved in that moment, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. I had been so focused on my own pain that I hadn't truly seen his. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting a part of himself he didn't understand. I reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were cold, but they curled around mine instantly, holding on like a drowning man grasping a lifeline. You don't have to have it all figured out, I said softly. You don't need a label. You don't need a new plan. We can just be. We can figure it out together. He looked at me, his eyes full of a desperate, fragile hope. But our friendship, he whispered. I already broke it. It's bruised, I said, squeezing his hand. But it's not broken. Nothing worth having is that easy to break. A small, watery smile touched his lips. It was the first real smile I had seen from him in weeks, and it was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. We sat there for a long time, holding hands across the kitchen table, the untouched pasta growing cold between us. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know what the future would look like. But the silence in the room was no longer brittle or suffocating. It was a space of possibility, a quiet ground where we could begin to rebuild. The foundation was no longer just friendship. It was something new, something terrifying and beautiful, something honest. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the familiar, quiet hum of hope return, not as a soaring, frantic thing, but as a steady, gentle warmth spreading from his hand to mine. The conversation at the kitchen table was not a magical fix. It did not instantly erase the hurt or answer all of our questions. Instead, it was like the moment a surgeon sets a broken bone, a painful, necessary alignment that marks the beginning of a long healing process. The days that followed were tentative, marked by a new kind of quiet. It was an observant quiet, a careful quiet, as we learned to navigate this new territory we had discovered between us. We were like two people learning a new language, starting with the simplest words, afraid of mispronouncing our intentions. We started talking, really talking, not just about work or the weather, but about fear and hope and what it felt like to have the entire blueprint of your life suddenly declared invalid. Liam talked about the pressure he had always felt to be a certain kind of man, a pressure that was so ingrained he had never even recognized it as a cage until he felt the first stirrings of a desire to leave it. I talked about my years of silence, about the love I had kept hidden like a secret, and the strange mixture of peace and pain that had come with it. We laid our vulnerabilities out on the table between us, and in that shared honesty, we began to stitch our friendship back together, using stronger, more resilient thread. The couch ritual returned, but it was different now. There were no more pretexts of exhaustion. One evening, a few days after our talk, we were sitting on opposite ends of the sofa, a respectable and safe distance between us, watching a documentary. The space felt like a tangible thing, a symbol of our caution. Halfway through, Liam looked at me, a question in his eyes. Is it okay if I? He trailed off, gesturing vaguely towards my side of the couch. Yes, I said, my voice soft. It's okay. He moved slowly, deliberately, and stretched out, resting his head in my lap, just as he had done so many times before. But this time, everything was different. This time, when my hand went to his hair, I didn't hesitate. I let my fingers sink into the soft strands, stroking his scalp gently. He let out a long, contented sigh and closed his eyes. There was no anxiety, no frantic internal analysis on my part. There was just a profound sense of rightness, of peace. It was not an ambiguous act of comfort anymore. It was a clear, intentional act of affection, mutually understood and accepted. We had found our way back to our sanctuary, but this time we had walked through the front door instead of sneaking in through the back. The closed bedroom doors remained for a little while longer, a final bastion of our old boundaries. We needed that space to process, to feel secure in our own identities before we merged them further. But the open, honest communication continued. We started going on what we hesitantly began to call dates. A walk in the park, a quiet dinner at a restaurant we both loved, a trip to a gallery. We were rediscovering each other, seeing the familiar lines of our relationship through a new, more intimate lens. I learned that his favorite color was the deep blue of the sky just after sunset. He learned that I always carried a spare memory card in my left pocket, a habit from my earliest days as a photographer. These small, mundane details became cornerstones of our new foundation. One Saturday night, after a long walk along the river, we came home, our hands linked, a comfortable silence between us. We stood in the hallway of our apartment, the space that had once been the site of his panicked retreat. He turned to me, his face illuminated by the soft light from the living room. "I don't think I'm scared anymore," he said quietly. "Me neither," I replied. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, deep kiss that was full of the certainty and peace we had fought so hard to find. It was a kiss that promised a future, a kiss that said we are home. When he pulled away, he didn't immediately go to his room. He just held my hand and led me towards his bedroom. He pushed the door open, all the way this time, and looked at me, an open, honest invitation in his eyes. And I walked through the threshold, leaving the last of our ghosts behind in the hallway. Now, our mornings look different. I still wake up first, drawn by the early light. But I no longer wake up alone. I wake up to the feeling of his arms slung over my waist, his slow, even breathing a warm puff against the back of my neck. I'll slip out of bed as quietly as I can and go to the kitchen to make coffee, and a few minutes later, he will appear, his hair a mess, his eyes still soft with sleep. He'll wrap his arms around me from behind, rest his chin on my shoulder, and mumble a good morning into my neck. The silence in our apartment is no longer empty or tense or brittle. It is full. It is the comfortable, easy silence of two people who know they are exactly where they are supposed to be, a silence built not on unspoken things, but on a deep and abiding understanding. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, bearing questions that seem simple on the surface. They are the hinges that swing open doors to rooms you never knew existed, revealing landscapes you never dared to imagine. For me, it was a text message on a Tuesday night, a simple request to wait up. It was a question that led to a confession that led to a crisis, and a crisis that led, finally, to a quiet, beautiful truth. We didn't find a neat label for what we are. We didn't need one. We simply found each other. We learned that the most important spaces we inhabit are not defined by walls or doors, but by the sense of safety and acceptance we build within another person. And in the beautiful, honest silence we learned to create together, we found our way home.